When 8-year-old Timothy was abandoned by his family in the harsh Montana wilderness of 1879, he thought he was going to die alone and forgotten. But when a massive grizzly bear approached him, instead of attacking, Timothy discovered that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source. But would this unlikely bond be strong enough to survive the dangers that lay ahead? The wagon wheels stopped turning, and 8-year-old Timothy Caldwell knew his life was about to change forever. His stepfather's angry voice cut through the cold Montana air like a knife, but Timothy couldn't make out the words from where he sat, huddled in the back of their covered wagon. It was late October in 1879, and the first snow had already started falling in the territory. Timothy pulled his thin coat tighter around his small body as he watched his mother Martha argue with her new husband near the front of the wagon. Their voices grew louder, but Timothy had heard these fights before. They always ended the same way, with him being blamed for something. "The boy eats too much," his stepfather said, loud enough for Timothy to hear now. "We barely have enough food to last the winter ourselves." Timothy's stomach growled at the mention of food. They hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and even then it was just a small piece of bread and some water. He reached into his pocket and felt the smooth wood of his father's carved horse, the only thing he had left from before his real father died 2 winters ago. Martha's voice became quiet and sad. "He's just a child, William. He's my son." "He ain't my son," William shot back, "and I won't watch my own family starve because of him." Timothy felt tears starting to build in his eyes, but he blinked them away. Crying never helped anything. His mother had taught him that crying only made men like William angrier. The arguing stopped suddenly, and Timothy heard footsteps coming toward the back of the wagon. His heart began beating faster as William's face appeared in the opening, his cold blue eyes staring down at the small boy. "Get out," William said simply. Timothy looked past William to where his mother stood, hoping to see her coming to help him. Instead, Martha was looking down at the ground, her shoulders shaking as she cried silently. "I said get out, boy." With trembling hands, Timothy climbed down from the wagon. The cold air hit him immediately, making him shiver. The ground was covered with a thin layer of snow, and more flakes were falling from the gray sky above. William tossed Timothy's small bundle of clothes onto the ground next to him. "You're old enough to take care of yourself now," he said. "Maybe you'll learn what it means to work for what you get." Timothy wanted to ask where he was supposed to go, what he was supposed to eat, how he was supposed to survive in the wilderness. But before he could say anything, William had already climbed back onto the wagon seat. "William, please!" Martha called out, finally looking up. But her husband was already snapping the reins, and the horses began moving forward. Timothy watched as the wagon rolled away, taking his mother and the only life he had ever known with it. The sound of the wheels grew quieter and quieter, until finally there was nothing but the whistle of wind through the pine trees. For the first time since his real father died, Timothy was completely alone. Timothy had never felt cold like this before in his entire life. He had been walking for what felt like hours, following a narrow animal trail that wound between tall pine trees and rocky outcrops. His feet were numb inside his worn boots, and his fingers were so cold he could barely feel them anymore. The snow was falling harder now, covering his tracks and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Timothy knew he needed to find shelter soon. But everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, and endless white snow. His stomach felt like it was eating itself from the inside. The last piece of bread he had saved from yesterday was long gone, and he hadn't seen any berries or other food since leaving the main trail. Even if there had been food, Timothy wasn't sure he would know what was safe to eat and what might make him sick. As darkness began to fall, Timothy spotted a large boulder with a small space underneath it. It wasn't much, but it would keep the snow off him for the night. He crawled into the tiny space and pulled his knees up to his chest, trying to stay warm. That's when he heard it, a low rumbling sound coming from somewhere nearby. Timothy's blood turned to ice. He had heard stories about the wild animals that lived in these mountains. Bears, mountain lions, wolves, all of them dangerous to a small boy alone in the woods. He tried to make himself even smaller as the sound grew louder. Through the falling snow, Timothy saw a massive shadow moving between the trees. It was bigger than anything he had ever seen, walking on 4 legs and covered in thick, dark fur. A bear. And not just any bear, but the largest grizzly Timothy could have imagined. The bear stopped about 20 feet away from Timothy's hiding spot. Its huge head turned in his direction, and Timothy was sure it had caught his scent. He held his breath and tried not to move, but his whole body was shaking from both cold and fear. Instead of charging or roaring like Timothy expected, the bear sat down in the snow. It tilted its massive head and looked directly at Timothy with dark, intelligent eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, to Timothy's complete surprise, the bear made a soft rumbling sound. It was plain, not angry or threatening, but almost gentle. It was unlike anything Timothy had ever heard before. The bear slowly stood up and walked to a cluster of bushes nearby. Using its huge paws, it carefully pushed aside the snow and revealed a small pile of late-season berries that had been hidden underneath. The bear looked at Timothy again, then at the berries, then back at Timothy. Timothy couldn't believe what he was seeing. This enormous wild animal, one that could easily kill him with a single swipe of its paw, was offering him food. His hunger was stronger than his fear. Timothy slowly crawled out from under the boulder, keeping his eyes on the bear the entire time. The bear took a few steps back, giving him space to reach the berries. As Timothy gathered the small, sweet fruits in his hands, he noticed something that made his heart skip. The bear had a long, deep scar running across its left shoulder, a mark that told a story of survival against impossible odds. "You're hurt too," Timothy whispered, his voice barely making a sound. The bear's response was that same gentle rumble, and somehow Timothy understood that he was no longer alone in the wilderness. Timothy's stomach growled so loudly that even Courage turned his massive head to look at him. The boy had been following his unlikely friend through the Montana wilderness for 3 whole days now, and his body was starting to give up hope. "I'm so hungry I could eat tree bark," Timothy whispered, his voice cracking like old leather. But as soon as he said it, something amazing happened. Courage seemed to understand exactly what the boy needed. The great bear stood up on his back legs and sniffed the air with his huge black nose. Then he dropped back down and started walking toward a cluster of bushes that Timothy hadn't even noticed. Hidden beneath the golden leaves were dozens of fat, purple huckleberries, the kind his real father used to pick for him before he died. Timothy's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't sad tears. "You knew they were there, didn't you?" he asked, stuffing handfuls of the sweet berries into his mouth. Courage made a low, happy sound that rumbled through his chest like distant thunder. As they shared the meal together, Timothy noticed something that made his heart skip. The bear's left shoulder had a deep, jagged scar running across it, the kind that only comes from fighting for your life. Someone or something had hurt Courage badly, just like Timothy's stepfather had hurt him with cruel words and empty promises. "We're both broken, aren't we?" Timothy said softly, reaching out to gently touch the scar. Instead of pulling away, Courage leaned into the boy's small hand, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to show him such kindness. That night, as they huddled together under a rocky overhang, Timothy made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out the small wooden horse his real father had carved for him, the only thing he had left from his old life. The paint was chipped, and one ear was missing, but it was still his most precious treasure. "My pa made this for me," Timothy whispered, showing it to Courage. "He said it would give me courage when I needed it most." The bear studied the tiny carving with eyes that seemed almost human, then very carefully touched it with the tip of his nose. For the first time since his stepfather had called him worthless and left him to die, Timothy smiled a real smile. I think that's what I'll call you, Courage, because that's what you've been giving me every single day." The bear made that gentle rumbling sound again, and Timothy knew without a doubt that he'd found something more valuable than all the gold in the Montana mountains. But as the wind began to howl through the rocks above them, carrying the scent of winter and danger, Timothy had no idea that their friendship was about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. The morning sun was painting the mountain peaks bright orange when the sound of breaking branches made both Timothy and Courage freeze like statues. Someone was coming through the forest, and they weren't being quiet about it. 3 rough-looking men crashed through the underbrush, carrying long rifles that glinted in the sunlight. The leader was a tall, mean-faced man with a scar running from his left ear to his chin. His clothes were dirty and torn, and his eyes had the hungry look of a wolf who hadn't eaten in weeks. "Well, well, well," the scarred man said, his voice as cold as winter ice. "Look what we got here, boys. The biggest grizzly bear I've seen in all my years trapping these mountains." He raised his rifle and pointed it straight at Courage's heart. "That hide will buy us supplies for the whole winter." Timothy's blood turned to ice water in his veins. These weren't friendly travelers. They were hunters, and they wanted to kill his only friend in the world. But then one of the other hunters, a shorter man with missing teeth, noticed Timothy sitting next to the bear. "Hold on there, Pike," he said, scratching his dirty beard. "What's that boy doing sitting so close to a wild beast? That thing should have torn him apart by now." Pike's eyes narrowed as he studied the strange sight before him. A small boy and a giant grizzly bear, sitting side by side like they were old friends sharing stories by a campfire. It didn't make sense, and things that didn't make sense made Pike angry. "Boy!" Pike shouted, his voice echoing off the mountain walls. "Get away from that monster before it kills you. We're here to save your life." Timothy felt his whole body start to shake, but not from fear. He was shaking from anger. The same burning anger he'd felt when his stepfather called him worthless and drove away without looking back. "He's not a monster," Timothy said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "His name is Courage, and he's been taking care of me. He's more of a family to me than anyone else ever was." The third hunter, a fat man with tiny pig eyes, laughed so hard he nearly dropped his rifle. "Did you hear that, boys? The kid thinks a grizzly bear is his family. That's the funniest thing I ever heard." But Pike wasn't laughing. He'd been hunting these mountains for 15 years, and he'd never seen anything like this before. Bears didn't make friends with humans. Bears killed humans, or they ran away from them. They didn't share berries and sleep next to them like gentle giants. "I don't care if that bear raised you from a baby," Pike snarled, raising his rifle again. "A grizzly hide is worth $50 in Helena, and I ain't leaving here empty-handed." That's when something incredible happened. Courage, who had been sitting quietly through the whole conversation, slowly stood up to his full height. All 9 feet of him rose like a mountain coming to life, and when he opened his mouth and roared, the sound was so powerful that rocks tumbled down from the cliffs above them. The 3 hunters stumbled backward, their faces white with terror. But what happened next would change Timothy's life forever, because sometimes the greatest courage comes from the smallest people in the most dangerous moments. The morning mist hung thick between the pine trees when Pike's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "That bear's gonna make us rich, boys." Timothy's stomach dropped as he watched the 3 trappers spread out in a wide circle, their rifles gleaming in the pale sunlight. Courage stood perfectly still beside him, but Timothy could feel the tension in the great bear's muscles. "Please don't hurt him," Timothy called out, his voice cracking with fear. "He's never done anything wrong to anyone." Pike spat into the dirt and laughed. "Son, that thing's a killer by nature. You're just too young and stupid to see it." The trapper's weathered face twisted into a cruel smile. "Step away from the beast, and we'll make sure you get back to town safe." But Timothy remembered the gentle way Courage had shared berries with him, how the bear had kept him warm during freezing nights, and how those ancient eyes had never shown anything but kindness. "No," he said, surprised by how strong his own voice sounded. "I won't leave him." The second trapper, a thin man with nervous hands, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Pike, maybe we should just move on. There's other game in these mountains." "Shut your mouth, Davies," Pike snapped. "That hide's worth more than we'll see in 6 months of regular trapping." His finger moved to the trigger of his rifle. "Boy, this is your last warning." Timothy's heart hammered against his ribs. But something deep inside him had changed during his weeks in the wilderness. The scared, worthless child his stepfather had abandoned was gone. In its place stood someone who understood what it meant to have a friend worth fighting for. "You'll have to shoot me first," Timothy declared, stepping directly in front of Courage's massive form. The forest fell deadly quiet, except for the whisper of wind through the branches. Pike's eyes narrowed as he studied the small boy who dared to challenge 3 armed men. "You got more backbone than I gave you credit for, kid. Too bad it's gonna get you killed." But before Pike could raise his rifle, Courage moved with surprising speed for such a large creature. The bear didn't attack. Instead, he positioned himself so that Timothy was completely shielded by his enormous body. A low, rumbling growl rolled from Courage's throat, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Davies took a nervous step backward. "Pike, I don't like this. That bear's protecting the boy like he's its own cub." "Bears don't think like that," Pike insisted. But Timothy could hear doubt creeping into the man's voice. "They're just dumb animals." Timothy placed his small hand on Courage's thick fur and felt the steady rhythm of the bear's breathing. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "Courage thinks plenty. He thinks enough to know the difference between good people and bad people." The third trapper, who hadn't spoken yet, lowered his rifle slightly. "Maybe the boy's right, Pike. I've never seen anything like this before." Pike's face turned red with anger. "You yellow-bellied cowards! It's just one bear." He raised his rifle toward Courage's head, but his hands were shaking now. The bear's intelligent eyes stared straight at him, unblinking and unafraid. In that moment of hesitation, Timothy saw something he'd never expected to see in Pike's cruel face: uncertainty. The trapper had come expecting to kill a wild animal, but instead found himself facing a creature that clearly cared more about protecting a child than saving its own life. The standoff stretched on, each second feeling like an hour, while Timothy wondered if his newfound courage would be enough to save the gentle giant, who had already saved him in so many ways. Thunder crashed overhead, as if the sky itself was angry about the violence brewing in the forest below. Pike's rifle trembled in his grip, while sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Timothy could see the war happening inside the trapper's mind. Greed, fighting against something that might have been his last bit of human decency. "This ain't natural," Davies whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "Look how that bear's standing. He's thinking about every move, just like a person would." Timothy felt Courage's muscles tense beneath his hand. The great bear was ready to fight if necessary. But Timothy could sense something else. Courage was waiting, giving the men one last chance to make the right choice. "Animals don't have feelings," Pike muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "They don't care about nothing except eating and surviving." "Then why hasn't he attacked us?" the third trapper asked. His name was Coleman. Timothy had heard Pike call him earlier. "We've been threatening his life for 10 minutes, and he's just standing there, protecting the boy." Timothy stepped slightly to the side so he could see Pike's face. The trapper's eyes were wide with confusion, staring at Courage like he was seeing something impossible. "You know what I think?" Timothy said softly. "I think you're scared." Pike's face twisted with rage. "I ain't scared of nothing, especially not some mangy bear and a worthless kid." "Then why are your hands shaking?" Timothy asked. The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Pike glanced down at his trembling rifle, then back at Timothy's steady gaze. For the first time since the confrontation began, the trapper seemed to really see the boy in front of him, not just an obstacle to his prize, but a child who had somehow found the courage to stand up to 3 grown men. Davies lowered his weapon completely. "Pike, I'm done with this. Killing that bear would be like murder." "Don't go soft on me now," Pike snarled. But Coleman was already backing away too. "The boy's right about one thing," Coleman said quietly. "You are scared. We all are. That bear could have killed us already, but he chose not to. Makes a man think about what kind of person he really is." Timothy watched Pike's face change as the words sank in. The cruel confidence was cracking like ice on a spring river. Behind the anger and greed, Timothy glimpsed something unexpected: shame. "I've seen plenty of animals in my time," Pike said slowly, his rifle drooping toward the ground. "But I never seen one that—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "One that loves someone?" Timothy suggested gently. Pike's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had settled on them. He looked at Courage again, really looked at him, and Timothy saw the exact moment when the trapper understood what he had been about to destroy. Not just a bear, but a friendship that had saved two lost souls. "God help me," Pike whispered. "What was I about to do?" Rain began to fall in fat droplets that pattered against the pine needles above them. Courage relaxed slightly, but kept his protective stance between Timothy and the three men. The bear's ancient eyes held no anger, only patience, as if he had always known this moment would come. Timothy pulled the small wooden horse from his pocket and held it up for Pike to see. "My real father gave me this before he died. He said it would give me courage when I needed it most." He looked up at the massive bear beside him. "But courage here taught me something my father never could. He taught me that being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared." Pike stared at the carved horse for a long moment, then at the boy and bear who had somehow changed everything he thought he knew about the world. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the falling rain. "I reckon you learned that lesson better than most grown men ever do, son." A wooden cross stood crooked in the spring mud, and Timothy knew his time with Courage was ending. The settlers from Copper Creek had been searching for him all winter, led by stories of a boy living wild with a giant bear. Now, as the snow melted in 1880, their voices echoed through the valley like church bells calling him home. "There he is!" shouted Mr. Henderson, pointing toward the stream where Timothy sat braiding grass into rope. Behind the bearded settler came his wife Martha, their twin daughters, and three other families who had traveled 2 days to find the lost boy. Their faces showed relief mixed with fear as they spotted Courage's massive form lounging in the afternoon sun. Timothy's stomach twisted into knots. These people wanted to help him, but they didn't understand what leaving meant. Courage had saved his life more times than he could count. During the blizzard in February, the bear had shared his own body heat to keep Timothy alive. When wolves circled their camp in March, Courage fought them off while Timothy hid in a cave. How could he abandon his protector? "Son, we've come to take you somewhere safe," called Mrs. Henderson, her voice gentle but firm. She wore a blue dress that reminded Timothy of his real mother, the one who died when he was 5. "You can't live out here like a wild animal." But Timothy wasn't wild anymore. Courage had taught him which berries were safe to eat, how to find clean water, and where to sleep when storms came. The bear had shown him that family wasn't just about blood. It was about choosing to care for someone even when it was hard. "I can't leave him," Timothy said, his voice cracking. "He needs me." The settlers exchanged worried glances. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, keeping his rifle low but ready. "Timothy, that bear is dangerous. It's not natural for a boy to live with wild beasts. God made us to live with our own kind." Courage sensed the tension and rose slowly to his feet. The settlers gasped and stepped backward, but Timothy remained calm. He had seen this dance before. Courage was showing his size as a warning, not a threat. The bear's dark eyes never left the strangers, but his breathing stayed steady. "He's not dangerous," Timothy insisted. "He's gentle and smart and—" "Bears kill people, son," interrupted another settler. "This one might seem tame now, But come winter, when food gets scarce, it'll turn on you. We've seen it happen before. Timothy felt tears building behind his eyes. He pulled the wooden horse from his pocket and squeezed it tight. These people meant well, but they didn't see what he saw. They looked at Courage and saw teeth and claws. Timothy looked at Courage and saw the being who had saved him from loneliness, taught him to be brave, and loved him when his own family threw him away. The sun was setting, painting the mountains purple and gold. Soon the settlers would camp for the night, and tomorrow they would try again to take him away. Timothy had one night left to decide between two different kinds of family, the one that wanted him safe and the one that had already proven its love. 6 winters had passed since Timothy chose to leave the wilderness, and now he returned as a different person entirely. The year was 1886, and Timothy Caldwell wore a surveyor's coat instead of ragged furs. His horse picked its way carefully down the familiar mountain trail, loaded with instruments and supplies for mapping the territory that would soon become a railroad route. But Timothy hadn't come back just for work. Hidden in his saddlebag was a promise he had carried for 6 long years. The Henderson family had given him everything: education, love, a future bright with possibilities. Timothy learned to read and write, studied mathematics and geography, even attended school in Helena during the winters. Mrs. Henderson taught him proper manners and how to use a fork. Mr. Henderson showed him carpentry and farming. The twin daughters, Mary and Ruth, became the sisters he never had. Yet every night before sleep, Timothy held the wooden horse and wondered if Courage still remembered him. The old campsite by the stream looked smaller than Timothy remembered. Fallen logs had replaced the neat fire circle, and wild grass grew where he once slept, curled against Courage's warm fur. For a moment, fear gripped his chest. What if the great bear had died? What if he had forgotten? What if 6 years was too long? Then he heard it, a low rumble from across the meadow. Courage emerged from the tree line, moving more slowly than before, but still magnificent. Gray streaked his dark fur, and his massive shoulders showed the stiff movements of age, but his intelligent eyes remained sharp and knowing. Timothy dismounted and walked forward, his heart hammering like a woodpecker. "Hello, old friend," he called softly. "I told you I'd come back." Courage studied him for a long moment, tilting his great head. Timothy had grown tall and lean, his voice deeper, his face changed by years of learning and living. But when Timothy pulled out a small wooden carving, a bear he had whittled during lonely school nights, Courage's eyes brightened with recognition. The reunion was gentle but profound. Courage approached slowly, sniffed Timothy's outstretched hand, then rumbled with what sounded remarkably like contentment. Timothy buried his face in the familiar fur, breathing in the wild scent of pine and earth and home. "I kept my promise," Timothy whispered. "I learned everything they wanted to teach me. I'm going to help build the railroad that connects people across these mountains. But I never forgot what you taught me first, that love doesn't depend on what others think you're worth." They spent 3 days together, walking old paths and sharing quiet moments by the stream. Timothy told Courage about his new life, about books and numbers and the wide world beyond the wilderness. In return, Courage showed him new trails, places where cubs had been born and seasons had changed the familiar landscape. On the final morning, Timothy understood it was time to leave again. But this goodbye felt different, not like abandonment, but like completion. He had needed Courage to save him from despair, and now Courage needed him to carry their story into the future. As Timothy rode away, he looked back once to see Courage watching from the ridge, massive and eternal, against the morning sky. The wooden horse rode in one pocket now, but the carved bear stayed behind as a gift, proof that some bonds survive any distance, and that the love between unlikely friends can change the world in ways no one expects.